During a year where equity challenges permeate all aspects of the education ecosystem, I am so pleased we'll have the opportunity to learn from Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. Gloria Ladson-Billings is the former Kellner Family Distinguished Professor of Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and faculty affiliate in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was a 2005-2006 president of the American Educational Research Association. During a recent keynote, Dr. Ladson-Billings reminded us that while equity is important, another term written into the Constitution of the United States is equally, if not more important, and that's justice. Justice is a fundamental right for all citizens. And throughout her career, Dr. Ladson-Billings has done her part to fight for justice and equitable outcomes for all. She is the author of the critically acclaimed books, including The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, and Crossing Over to Canaan, The Journey of New Teachers in Diverse Classrooms. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you, Denise, for those important and inspiring words. Fred, thank you for the very generous introduction. I want to get started because I want to make sure we have some time to do some Q&A. A lot of times it ends up with the speaker taking way too much time, and I am quite guilty of doing that. So let's see if we can get you up here. And I think this is probably a different title. That's what's in your program, but it really does comport with what you're doing, and that is On the Other Side of the Portal, Transforming Our Practice Post-Pandemics. I do want to start, however, by acknowledging that I am coming to you from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which occupies the ancestral Ho-Chunk land, which is a place that their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial. That in an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, and that decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. And indeed, this history of colonization informs our shared futures and collaboration and innovation. But today, the University of Wisconsin-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. If you noticed my title slide, I had the word pandemic in plural. And so I want to talk to you about a tale of 4 pandemics. Now, some of you are going, oh no, we got our hands full with one. What do you mean 4? Well, of course you know this one. The COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus, whatever you want to call it, and its variants, Delta, Omicron. And it's the reason that we're in this format. That one, I don't think I have to explain to you. It is one that our young people and each and every one of us is coping with. But it is not the only pandemic they are facing. You see, they are facing a pandemic of racism. Now, someone might say, oh, you're being too dramatic here. Well, my understanding from the epidemiologists is a pandemic is something that is happening around the world. And when we saw the awful killing of George Floyd, turns out that I heard from people around the world. Colleagues in the UK called to say, we have the same situation. You should read the case of Stephen Lawrence. Colleagues in France text to say, you know what? Same kind of stuff happens here. You should see how we treat North Africans of Muslim descent in the Paris metropole. Colleagues from Canada said, look at what we've done in Indian boarding schools. colleagues in Australia talk about what happened with Indigenous people there. It is pandemic. It's everywhere. A third pandemic is a coming economic one. And I know that the Congress is doing all kinds of things to prop up this economy, but we are seeing inflationary rises. We are seeing people failing to go back to work. And even though, as I've said, that the Congress has done some things, we still have people who are anticipating being evicted. We have people who are anticipating foreclosure on their homes. So many women left the workforce in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic that economists began calling it a she-cession instead of a recession. 2.8 million women in the US. And again, why do we call it pandemic and not epidemic? Because we're in a global economy. So what happens here has a ripple effect around the globe. And then the fourth one is one that I think we might know intellectually, but in many ways we don't acknowledge regularly, and that is the impending environmental catastrophe. Now, I often use this picture of fires in the West because my own grandchildren all live in California. But it could be what's happening in the Gulf Coast region, where we are seeing more storms and more intense storms. Over the Labor Day weekend, those storms detoured and came up the East Coast, creating flash flooding in New Jersey and New York. Recently, the University of Bath did a study, a survey of over 10,000 young people. And the thing that they are most concerned about is environmental degradation. They are worried, sick about climate change. And on top of that, those worries, they are worried that the adults, you and I, who have responsibility for stepping up and doing something, aren't taking it serious. So here we got 4 pandemics at least. There may be more, but there's 4 that I'm aware of that our young people are grappling with, and some of them are not faring well with it. Almost every school district that I know is seeing an increase of violence. Kids just so anxious and fights breaking out. And of course, we're seeing school shootings. Now, all of this probably sounds like gloom and doom, and you're probably saying, this is not how I wanted to start my morning. But I want to suggest to you that it is not all gloom and doom. The silver lining that I want to speak to actually comes to me from the writing of an Indian novelist by the name of Arundhati Roy. She wrote a wonderful piece that you are able to pick up free. It's not behind a firewall. It's called The Pandemic is a Portal. You go online and search that, you will find this wonderful essay. And here's a quote from that essay that is, to me, inspiring in the midst of these pandemics. She says that historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. It's those last 2 sentences that inspire me, that as bad as things seem, we can actually walk through this portal. We don't have to bring all that stuff we had on the other side with us, that we can be ready to imagine this other world and be ready to fight for it. Now, I'm a person who loves frames and metaphors. And so a metaphor that I've used as I began thinking about this back in 2020 was the fact that each and every one of us have a mobile device. I don't even have to ask you if you have one because you just do. They have become ubiquitous. And unfortunately, because they are machines, they are devices, they don't always work the way you want them to work. In fact, I woke up this morning and thought I had been charging mine all night. I wasn't. That wasn't the device's fault. That was operator error. But I want to suggest to you that when they don't do what we want them to do, sometimes we try a few things. We might turn them off and then turn them back on, reboot them. If that doesn't help us, you might take out the SIM card, right? And blow on it. Maybe there was a little dust on it and it wasn't working. If that doesn't help, you might take your battery out. Make sure that all your battery contacts are clear and that they're actually touching the way they should. That doesn't help. You might get to be a little ambitious and go online, get on your laptop and look for a tech support group and tell them what you're experiencing and see if there's anybody else who had the same problem. If you're fortunate, somebody did, and they might be able to walk you through it. But more often than not, it can't be fixed over the tech support group. So you take yourself to the place where you got your phone. Maybe it's your cell phone store, maybe it's the Apple store, maybe it's LG, Samsung Galaxy, or maybe it's your provider, T-Mobile or Verizon, AT&T, and someone who, at my age, probably looks to be about 17 years old in a t-shirt, comes to help you. And they may try some of the very same things you try. And if none of those work for them either, they will say something to you that for someone like me is the kiss of death, because they're going to say, I think it is time for a hard reset. Oh, why is that the kiss of death for me? Because I always forget to back my phone up. And if you're like me and you're not backing it up, you just charge it, but you don't back it up, well, you're going to lose some stuff. You're going to lose maybe data. You're going to lose pictures that you took. You're going to lose contacts. You might even lose wherever you are in that Candy Crush game. I don't know. But what's going to happen is once they reset it, you're going to get a device that looks a lot like it did when it first came from the factory. I like that metaphor. I like the idea that we could actually reset our schools. I bristle at people saying, oh, let's get back. Can't wait till we get back to normal. No, normal was not very good for a lot of students. For some students, normal meant never getting into an advanced placement class or never having an opportunity to take an honors course. Normal meant being suspended and over-identified for special education. Normal might have meant being expelled. Now, I don't want to go back to normal. Talking about transformation, I want to go to new. So, how did I come up with this idea of this reset? I wish I could say I was smart enough to think this up all by myself. I used to be a history teacher, so I'm always looking for lessons from history. And two historical lessons stood out in my mind, both of them from the post-World War II era. On the left side, you see a picture from Japan, post-World War II. And one of the things that happened in Japan at the end of the war, you know your history, you know they were with the Axis and they were defeated. And they experienced the atomic bomb, both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even before that, they had been firebombed unmercifully for some time. They didn't just go back to school after World War II and say, okay, young people, let's just open our books. Let's go back to what we were doing. No, they decided to reset. And they did two things to reset. One of the things they did was they expanded the learning opportunities for girls. If you've ever been to Japan, you know it's a very gendered society. And girls often don't have the same opportunities as boys. So they began to pay more attention to the education of girls. The second thing they did is they looked to the West and they realized that their organization in Japan was one that mostly had elementary and secondary schools. They had nothing in the middle. Now, at that time, we probably had what we call junior high schools. Today, we now have middle schools that philosophically are not exactly the same, but they are paying attention to teaching and learning among early adolescents. And it's something that Japan hadn't done. They decided to do that. It's like, let's not just go back to what we've done. Let's do something different. Let's reset. On the right, you have a picture from Italy. Again, one of the Axis Alliance folks lost the war, had been under a fascist regime, and they decided we cannot raise another generation of fascists. We have to have young people who can think for themselves, who can problem solve, and we can't wait till they get to be adolescents. We got to start early. So what you are seeing is a photo from the Amelia Reggio preschool, undoubtedly one of the best preschools in the world. In fact, Howard Gardner, the psychologist from Harvard, says, you know, Reggio Emilia is indeed the best preschool. I know here at Wisconsin, we often send our early childhood candidates to Reggio Emilia because they were trying to see if they could develop a preschool environment in which kids began to make their own decisions, their own choices, solve their own problems. So those are two, I think, concrete examples of resets. I have been working more than 30 years on a notion of pedagogy that I think represents a bit of a change. And I called it culturally relevant pedagogy. If you know the work, you probably know it from, from this book, The Dream Keepers. That's the second edition. And over the time that we've been in virtual spaces, I've actually completed a third edition. It's like the book that will never die. So look forward next spring in the third edition. If you're kind of an education research nerd like me, maybe you know my work from a scholarly article I wrote for the American Educational Research Journal published in 1995 called Toward the Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. However you know the work, you probably have heard the term and seen every kind of iteration and manifestation of it that maybe if I were to take a look at it, I might say, I don't think that's what I meant when I talked about this 30 years ago. So let me give you the 50-cent tour of culturally relevant pedagogy. I want you to have in mind an equilateral triangle. And hopefully that is equilateral. That if it isn't, blame Bill Gates because I got it from Microsoft. But I wanted to use an equilateral triangle because I wanted to really emphasize that each of these three components are equally important. Equilateral triangle, equal sides, equal angles. If you take any one away, you no longer have an equilateral triangle. What am I saying? If you take any of these components away, you don't have culturally relevant pedagogy. So quickly, let me tell you what they are. Then I want to go back and give you a brief description. First one is fairly obvious, academic achievement. But more specifically, I'm talking about student learning. And the reason why I'm modifying it with that term is a lot of times when you say academic achievement, people quickly default to, oh, she's talking about test scores. No, I'm not. not against taking a test, but what I'm suggesting to you is that students learn a lot more than we could ever test. So we're more interested in what students learn. The second component is what I call the most misunderstood component, cultural competence. People believing that, oh, I got to have some posters on the wall. Oh, I got to have books that have the faces colored in. No, it really is more than that. It is allowing students to start with their own culture as a place to understand and learn, but to acquire fluency and facility in at least one other culture. See, when I say it that way, you begin to understand that it doesn't let white students off the hook. They too need to be culturally confident. They need to be able to operate in cultures beyond their own because they're not going to have the luxury of being just in cultural enclaves. They're going to be dealing with a globally interconnected world. So that one's the most misunderstood. And this one, the sociopolitical or critical consciousness, is the most ignored. Oh, I don't want to do anything political. Well, your understanding of political probably is around partisanship. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about being able to answer the questions that plague us, being able to take the skills and the knowledge that we learn in school to solve our real life problems. And I'm not talking about solving adult problems. Kids have a set of problems of their own that they want solved. And so it's teaching them that the skills that I am imparting to you, the ability to read, ability to write, to compute, to engage in science, to look back over social studies, to explore the arts, give you a vehicle for dealing with a problem that you're confronted with. So let me just kind of give you an explanation of each of these. So let's start with the supporting student learning. Here's the dilemma that most teachers struggle with: depth versus coverage. The whole idea that just way too much to teach. We all know that the curriculum keeps expanding. We never take anything out. And as someone who used to teach US history, trust me, there's no way you start with the age of exploration and end with the election of Joseph R. Biden and Kamala Harris. It can't be done, not well. So teachers are always having to make choices about what to emphasize. You do it because you want to make sure that students are learning, not that you are covering material. You also have to move away from this notion that, oh, the reason I have a high failure rate is because I'm rigorous. I'm not lowering my standards. No, maybe you have a high failure rate because you're not teaching very well. There is nothing magical about failing students to suggest that your courses have very high standards. So one of the ways that I want you to reorient and rethink student learning is to move away from this particular metaphor. I told you I love metaphors, right? Of the sieve. That the idea is that we just put all the kids in the sieve and we just push, 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 push. And only the ones that come out on the other side are worthy and they can move on. Ones that get left in the sieve that don't make it through, we kind of just toss aside. I want you to trade that metaphor for this one. Not a sieve, but a net. And what do I mean by that? Think about EMTs or firefighters. None of them go to an incident saying, oh, we're going to save some of these people. No, they go with the idea is we're going to save everybody. That's our job. I actually happen to be one of these people who believes that there are certain jobs, certain professions in which we cannot have a margin for error. We cannot say, oh, there's always a few bad apples. I don't believe there ought to be a few bad apples who are airline pilots. See, I don't want to get on a plane with a pilot who says, about 80% of the time I'm pretty good at landing this thing. No, you need to be 100%. And I would say that I have the same feeling about police officers. We don't need a few bad apples. People lose lives when we have a few bad apples. And guess what? I don't think we can tolerate a few bad apples in education. Now, I know we do, and we have them, but I don't think we should have any. I think if you choose this profession, you are choosing to reach everyone. So that's my spiel on student learning. On cultural competence, as I said, it's the ability to be firmly grounded in one's own culture of origin, speak your language, to know your history, to share your customs and traditions, but to be fluent in at least one other culture. Now, the person who really inspires me around this notion is Professor Emerita from Ohio State University, Rudine Sims. Because Rudine Sims says that we are obligated to give students mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. What is a mirror? The ability to pick up a text, the ability to engage in a curriculum in which you see yourself. The window, the ability to engage in texts and curriculum in which you see a wider world. You see people who are different from yourself and that you learn from that. And then that sliding glass door are the tools that let you go back and forth seamlessly. I remind people that I have traveled to 6 of the 7 continents. And every place that I've gone, the only place I haven't been is Antarctica. And I'll tell you right now, if you have a cousin there, tell them don't invite me. I live in Wisconsin, I'm cold enough. But seriously, every place I've gone, I've had a chance to share what it's like to be Black, what it's like to be an American, what it's like to be a Black American woman. But I've also had the opportunity to learn. That's what we want for our young people. And then finally, the sociopolitical consciousness. I love using this image of Thomas Jefferson. I did tell you that I was a history teacher. What I didn't tell you is that I am from, and I did most of my teaching, public school teaching in Philadelphia. So I live and breathe this Independence Hall stuff. But I love that Jefferson says this. He says, above all things, I hope the education of the common people will be attended to. Now we read that in 2021 and shrug our shoulders. Yeah, that makes sense. That was a radical statement in the 1700s because common people didn't send their kids to school in the 1700s. Only rich people sent their kids to school, and they typically sent them either, if they were in the South, they may have sent them to New England, or they may have sent them to Europe. So here is Jefferson saying the common people need to be educated. Why? Follow the quote. Convinced that on their good sense we may rely with the most security for the preservation of a due degree of liberty. He doesn't say educate them so they can get a job. He doesn't say educate them so they can get into a good college. He says that they have to preserve our liberty. That's the whole point of the critical consciousness. Now, I started doing this work in the late 1980s. It has changed. It has to change. Any good theory that cannot evolve probably isn't a good theory, in fact. And so here we are at what I would call the evolution of culturally relevant pedagogy. And if I were actually in a physical room with you, I might ask this question. How many of you are on Twitter or TikTok? Now, I know people either holding their noses or going, oh, I hate that stuff. The truth of the matter is that's where our young people are. So if you're not engaging in some form of social media, even if it's just monitoring what's going on, you're in a whole parallel universe to that which our young people are in. And unfortunately, when I go into schools, I see signs like this. Now, come on, y'all. Everybody's got a mobile device. Everybody uses them. Why are we not helping our young people learn how to use them appropriately? When I go in schools and I ask, why do you have that sign? Here's the number one answer. They're a distraction. Okay. But I think, well, maybe you never took child or adolescent development, because everything is a distraction for kids. Everything. When I go into a single gender school, what I hear, girls are a distraction. If it's all boys, if it's all girls, I hear boys are a distraction. Do you know I once had a youngster, I was teaching middle school, I once had a youngster for whom the window in my classroom was a distraction. He just would zone out, just couldn't stay with me. Now I couldn't board up the window. But what I had to do was work with this youngster and say, I know you need a few minutes each period that you're with me to just kind of go up to the side. Can you just give me a little signal to say, hey, Mrs. Billings, I'm taking a break here. We have to teach them how to use the devices in ways that are productive. And in fact, what our young people have is not really a cell phone. It's a computer. Because if you were to check their logs, they don't make that many calls. They're typically texting, or they are posting on social media, or at least following social media, or they're looking up information. They're scrolling on the internet. We've got to begin to understand that the new digital divide is not one about who has money and who doesn't, because everybody's got one of these devices. It turns out that there's a study that said when people have to give up everything, they lose their cars, they lose their homes, the last thing they will give up is a cell phone. So the new digital divide is not really socioeconomic. It's not even gender. It tends to be generational, that our young people keep these things with them all the time. I'm someone who, I love technology, but sometimes if I've gone somewhere and left my cell phone, I'll just say I'll get it when I come back. These young people, if they leave their cell phone, they go right back to go get that cell phone because it's that important to them. So back in 1989, when I did the Dreamkeeper study, what I saw is that most of the teachers had a focus on cultural history. They were revealing those things that the textbooks had omitted, certain people, places, events that didn't get talked about in their texts. They also had a focus on community issues. So things like urban renewal, which today you might talk about as gentrification, things like the veterans' concerns, because the district I was in had a VA hospital nearby, things like homelessness, all of that still worth talking about. But there was a limited focus on student culture. Now, I talked about the kids, the cultures from which they come, but they also come from youth culture. They are creators of culture. I had one teacher who used rap lyrics to teach poetry. Today's dream keepers, oops, that's a repeat, sorry. Today's dream keepers need to include popular culture in their understanding of culture. They need to recognize hip hop's longevity and power. Now, I know somebody's gonna know she's really gone off the deep end now. But I want to tell you, when hip hop first burst on the scene, and I was there, people were saying, oh, that stuff is terrible. That stuff is not gonna last. Well, can I tell you that I am 40 years, we are 40 years into this not lasting? I teach a course on hip hop and education. And the question that I ask the students is, who introduced you to hip hop? The most common answer is my parents. So here we are teaching the children of hip hop heads. We also need to catch up with Madison Avenue, because Madison Avenue seems to always figure this out. Because their livelihood requires them to know what's happening out in the world. So let me give you this example from 1992 of Post serials incorporating hip hop.
You watch me get Fred's Fruity Pebbles. Who are you?
I'm the master rapper and I'm here to sing. I love Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
He loves Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
The bedrock yellow, orange, purple, lime, and red. But to get the fruity taste, I gotta trick Fred. Fruity.
To get the fruity taste, he's got to trick Fred. Barney.
Guess that's a wrap.
House Fruity Pebbles cereal, part of this nutritious breakfast. Yep.
So if you are a fan of the golden age of hip hop, you recognize that Barney was invoking Run DMC with the pork pie hat and the wraparound sunglasses and a gold chain. And did you notice Barney had on a pair of Adidas? When have you ever seen the Flintstones with shoes on? My point here is that Post Foods figured out there's something about this that speaks to young people, and that's our consumer base. So we're going to figure out how to incorporate this. Not only did they get it in 1992, they continue to get it.
Hello? Yeah, yup. I can't find it. I'm looking for it right now. One second. They say quit, they say done. They say we're too grown for fun. They say old, we say young. We say playful's never done. Don't fight the feeling, just let it flow. Stack it up, rack it up, let it go. Laughter is calling, pick up the phone. Let's stay playful, Oreo. Everyone's welcome, don't need a label. If we're still smiling, the future's bueno. I got a secret the world should know. Let's stay playful, Oreo. Hello? Psych. And when you do, every day's full. For every moment, we're grateful. No half, our glass all the way full. Yeah, yup, stay playful.
So here's Nabisco using hip hop artist Wiz Khalifa to sell Oreo cookies. They understand that there's something about this that is speaking to young people in a very powerful way. So what does all of this stuff mean in this post-pandemic world? Well, I remind people to remember what happened post-Katrina. And here's what I mean, and I'm talking about educators. A lot of people talked about as Katrina was at its close, oh, we got to do what we can to get back to normal. Seriously? Of course, normal wasn't very good in New Orleans. People were underemployed, unemployed, had substandard housing. They had limited access to healthcare, and their schools were a mess. Why would you want to get back to that? Now, I want to be clear. I don't agree with what people decided to do instead of getting back to normal. I don't think that was the right solution. But I'm sharing that with you because just like many people just want to get back to normal in this post-pandemic, somebody's sitting around thinking about doing something different. Why can't we be the ones to think of something different that is productive and will really help propel our young people? What are the changed assumptions that came about because of the pandemic? For example, before the pandemic, I heard folks say, oh, you can't give those kids digital devices, because they're going to destroy them, or they're going to sell them. They're not going to bring them back. They're going to lose them. Well, turns out we had to give them those devices. And for the most part, they did with them what we needed them to do. I asked the question about how important are the tests. I am not an anti-test person. I think the tests tell us something. They just don't tell us everything. And one of our changed assumptions might be that we do not have to test every single year. Many of our states did not test in 2020. The world didn't come to a screeching halt because of it. What's the role of social emotional learning? Our kids didn't miss math packets. They didn't miss biology labs. They miss the social interaction. They miss seeing their peers. They miss seeing caring adults. What's the role of the social emotional? And how do people like me who theorize about pedagogy, how do I begin to rethink it? What does the post-pandemic era bode for me as I think about preparing our teachers to teach in a culturally relevant way? So think about student learning. What actually counts as learning? I'm someone who really pays close attention to language. So there's certain terms I never use. I just think they're inappropriate. And I think that they create a particular way of thinking. So for example, you never hear me use the term at risk. What do you mean at risk? As Margaret Beale Spencer says, to be human is to be at risk. But we don't call everybody at risk, just some people. So one of the terms that has emerged post-pandemic is learning loss. That term just grates on me because the human mind is always learning. It's not losing learning unless people have traumatic brain injury or perhaps are suffering dementia. Now, were they learning what was going to be on that test? Probably not. But they were learning lots of things. I know kids who had to go to work with their parents because there was no childcare. They were learning a lot of things. So what are we counting as learning? And how do we determine what students know versus what they have? My typical example of explaining this question is that we've all been to that science fair where someone who's like 9 years old brings in a project that no 9-year-old could have possibly done. But if you just dig a little deeper, if you scratch beneath the surface, what you find out about that 9-year-old is that their father is a physicist at the local university. Oh, okay, now it makes sense. But we pretend like that didn't enter into the creation of that science project. And we give them credit. But what we're actually crediting is what they have, not what they know. Can we finally put tests in their proper perspective? As I said in the previous slide, I'm not anti-tests. I think the tests tell us something. They just don't tell us everything. If tests told us everything, then the best drivers in our society are 16. Because these people pass the test. But you know as well as I do, these people cannot drive, not even a little bit. So the tests are important in helping us make some assessments about where we're going, but they should not be something that we saddle onto young people, that we saddle on the schools, we saddle on the districts to talk about their goodness, right? And then can we measure academic progress versus external standards? I have the word progress in all caps because I'm really, really, really more interested in what young people look like when they come in the fall and then what they look like when they leave in the spring. I always give this example because I've actually seen it happen. 5th grade teacher. The youngster comes into her classroom reading at the 2nd grade level. But that teacher does everything she knows how to do to move that student along. She spends additional time with them. She gives him all kinds of little short projects and things to work on. She just encourages him. She tutors him. She does everything she can. And by the end of the year, this kid who started at a 2nd grade level is now at a 4th grade level. But when it comes time to take that test, that external standard, he's still below basic because he's not on grade level, right? He's not at 5th grade. He's at 4th. But look at the progress. He's made 2 years of progress. So I'm not saying you never have an external standard. I'm saying that external standard needs to be alongside of the progress that our young people make. What about post-pandemic cultural competence? Again, what is the role of youth culture? Our young people are not going to be any more inspired by dull teaching of Black history, dull teaching of Chicano history, and dull teaching of indigenous. They want to know about themselves too. So what is the role of youth culture and Latinx culture? Even if what you say is, well, we don't have any Latinx students. So the culture of the United States reflects aspects of Latinx culture. So all students should be knowing something about it. And of course, indigenous culture. I started out with a land acknowledgement. All of our young people ought to know whose land they are on. If you just go to the website native-lands.ca and type in your city, state, it'll show you on the map who was in that territory before you. And what do you know about those folks? What's the role of socioeconomic differences? I think a lot of times we are very flat with our understanding of culture. But I will tell you that a middle-class African-American student is not having the same experience as a working class or a poor African-American students. They may have some of the same encounters around racism, but what they go home to may be quite different. And that leads to the third question. How do we help our teachers understand disparity? If a youngster is homeless, trust me, your homework assignment is not the most important thing on that kid's mind. Question for that youngster is, where are we sleeping tonight? Are we still doing this couch surfing thing where we're going from relative to relative? Are we getting in the shelter? And are we going to have anything to eat tonight? Not, can I get through sets 1, 3, and 5 in the math book? And then what's the role of digital literacy? Our kids live in a digital culture. They're out there in cyberspace. And we tend not to want to be there. One of the things we didn't like about going virtual, because we didn't like teaching digitally, right? But I will tell you, some of y'all wasn't that great in person. So the digital was even a bigger challenge. So what is the role of digital literacy? How do our kids, we don't want them constantly with screen time. What's the right mix? How do we have them engage in that? Then around the critical consciousness. What is the post-pandemic critical consciousness about? What are the questions that we need to engage? In other words, our kids have all kinds of questions. And what should we be engaging in? Nature of the curriculum, nature of the teaching and the learning, the nature of their interactions out in the public. How do we help the public understand our changing needs? Before this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, most of the public didn't understand that we were literally in the business, in the food service business, that we were feeding a lot of kids. I know here in Madison, we had to set up food distributions at schools around the city. And one of the things that popped up in the midst of the food distribution was a transportation problem. So they were ready to give the food out, but some of our schools are divided by large thoroughfares and kids couldn't cross over to get it. So we actually had to have our local church use their vans, pick up food and deliver it. Public didn't understand that we do all of that kind of work. For what social emotional learning do we prepare? The idea is not to just have all the kids in a room on a yoga mat with the fingers together saying, For some kids, what's socially soothing and emotionally soothing for them is being able to have their own playlists and be able to just take 10 minutes out to just listen to something that they like and enjoy. For some kids, it's smaller group interactions. For some kids, it's like, I just need 5 minutes away from all of this. During the pandemic, I had the pleasure of visiting some schools virtually. And one school I visited in Baltimore. And I was very interested in how the kids were dealing with virtual learning. And so I said, how are you guys dealing with this? How you feel about it? I'll never forget this one young man at the high school said to me, he said, "Oh, I love it. I absolutely love this." I said, "Really? What do you love about it?" He said, "Listen, when these people get on my nerves, I just turn them off." I said, "Well, what happens then?" He said, "Oh, they'll call me in a few minutes. And I tell them I'm having internet connectivity problems." Now, we chuckled, but as I thought about this, what this young man was telling me is that for the first time in my life, I'm in control of my learning. When I've had enough, I've had enough. See, if I'm face to face with these folks and I've had enough, and I put my hoodie up and my head down on my desk, what's going to happen to me is they're going to send me out. Make it worse, they may suspend me. So we're going to think about what is the social-emotional learning we're preparing for. And then finally, how do we help students cope with what I'm calling pandemic trauma? Now, what's the difference between the social-emotional and the trauma? Well, on the social-emotional learning side, you often hear people say, "Oh, this pandemic has been terrible. We all in the same boat now." No. We're not all in the same boat. We've all been in the same storm. But some of us have ridden this storm out on a luxury liner, while others have been on a piece of driftwood, barely able to hold their heads above water, worried about where their next paycheck was going to come from or their next meal. The pandemic trauma that I am talking about is the fact that we have lost over 700,000 people in this country. And for some of our kids, that loss has been up close and personal. Over 140,000 kids have lost at least one parent. Some kids have lost other family members, neighbors, friends. Now you might be saying, well, kids, they cope with death before. True, but not death without ritual, not a way to say their goodbyes, not a funeral ceremony with 7 people or 10 people or a graveside ceremony with people spread out. This has been hard for our kids. You want to know why their fights are erupting everywhere? Because they don't know what to do with this trauma. They don't know what to do with this anxiety. And we didn't prepare because we were so anxious to, quote, get back to normal. I want to end with an example that is actually about 7 or 8 years old, but I think it's a wonderful example of what that culturally relevant pedagogy could look like from a young man that I had the pleasure of teaching when he was a freshman.
Neighborhoods are ovens with windows. And as the knob on global warming increases, lives are preheated until a soul souffles. Pancake stack projects are poured over with a humid as thick as molasses. Heat and humidity are the perfect appetizer on death's plate. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet from May to October, and senior citizen discount is every day. If thermometers can measure temperatures, they should be able to measure human anxiety. As the temperature rises, we reach boiling points. Attitudes of those around us rise quicker than mercury, and the pressure of staying cool causes us to explode. Compressed living complexes circulate heat and cause compressed feelings to converge upon our neighbors in the hood. So that 90% release of excess body heat talked about in science class is contributed to our local temperature rising. We crack open fire hydrants until we hear lights crying, raising taxes by lowering our body temperature. And if you couldn't afford a wind replacer, fridges and freezers were propped open until your 2 brothers' faces are frozen. Audiences applaud the ice cream man once that familiar jingle mingles with our ears. This sweet release of flooded heat is a godsend. But what do you know? The ice cream vendor's name is Noah. As the temperature rises, so do attitudes, death rates, bills, and ice cream stocks. Heat affects the elderly more than it does us. Their lungs resemble the Dow Exchange, rises and drops until they crash. Ambulances are summoned, riding down the street flooded with the contents of the only fire hydrant. And we have only just begun to fry.
What you just witnessed was the audition tape that an 18-year-old Elijah Furquan put together to come to the University of Wisconsin. His deep interest was in the environment. He did end up getting a degree in environmental studies. So he is a climate scientist here in the state, but on the weekend, he's still a spoken word artist. Our kids can do this. We can move away from the old. We can transform, we can come through that portal and move into the new. So I think I probably left a little bit of time for us to be able to engage in some conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ladson-Billings, for that really powerful presentation. I'm Suzanne Bouffard. I'm the Vice President of Publications at Learning Forward, and I have the honor to facilitate our Q&A today for a few minutes with Dr. Ladson-Billings. If you have questions, please include them in the chat box, and I will be posing them to our guest today. I have a first question for you, though. I was really struck by one of the questions and challenges you posed to all of us when you said, why can't we be the ones to think of some.
You went to mute, go back.
Sorry about that. Yes, so you posed to us a question and a challenge when you said, why can't we be the ones to think of something different in this time when we need a reset? It's such a powerful message for us starting out the conference and thinking about moving forward. I'm curious, why do you think so many educators do not feel empowered to be the ones to make change? And how can we encourage them to do that? How can we feel ourselves encouraged to do that, especially right now?
So I think, one of our challenges is that we feel like we're not turning around a rowboat. We got to turn around an ocean liner, or maybe it's one of those big things that the Army has. I don't, a destroyer or whatever. I don't have my naval terminology, whatever it is that they fly those planes off of at sea. Turning that around is hard. And so our unwillingness to do more experimentation, to do some small things, to say, let's try this. The conversation that I'm starting to have with superintendents right now is about how did you do your reentry? And people are looking at me like, what do you mean? We open schools. Well, no, that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. Our kids are just so anxious right now. This has been hard on them. And yet we don't want to turn that ocean liner around. We haven't said to teachers, I'm talking to administrators right now, we haven't said to teachers, you know what? Let's not worry about the curriculum right now. Let's not worry about the test right now. Let's try to get our kids in a good place where they know that if there's one place where we're going to have safety. I'm amazed when I go out to school and see these little folks, 5 and 6 years old, knowing that they're supposed to hand sanitize. I don't have to argue with a 5-year-old about keeping a mask on. I have to argue with somebody who's 35, right? So our kids have incredible adaptability and flexibility. And I think this is an opportune time for us to this press pause right now and figure out, okay, how are we going to truly do reentry? What's going to be, what are the strategies for checking in with kids? And are we applying them? You know, one of the things that we did here in Madison before the pandemic is we got rid of our SROs, the school resource officers, because it was the right thing to do. But now I'm reading in the paper because we're seeing fights. We probably were premature. We shouldn't have done that. Our kids need psychologists and social workers. They don't need somebody with a gun on their hip. So I'm just saying that I understand that institutionally it's hard to make a change, but clearly one of the places that we could, and people would give us space and grace if we had said, you know what, school's going to look a little bit different, folks, in that the way that we're going to bring our kids back is going to be a more gradual process to make sure everybody's okay.
There's a related question in the chat box that I think is really important on this topic. How do we support students' social and emotional learning when adults are also struggling with the same trauma?
Exactly. I mean, if I'd had more time, I would have also talked about the fact that many of our teachers in particular are not in a good place, that it's been hard for them too. Some teachers are out here having to teach, but they have their own children who have to be on virtual schooling, so they can't assist them. And again, what was the reentry plan? Did we begin to take note and pay attention to the needs of the adults who are in these environments? So I agree that I just don't think we've done a good job in terms of, we're so anxious to get back to something that we thought we wanted to be back at, that we weren't really fair to anybody in these circumstances.
Do you have any recommendations for educators who feel that their settings haven't prepared adequately of what to do now? What is a first step that you recommend people take next week?
I can't remember who said it, but I love the quote. It's never too late to do the right thing. So even though we've already started down a road, it's okay to say, you know what, let's back up a little bit. So, if I'm going back into a classroom, I'm going to really be able to, what I would say to students is, you know what, we just kind of started rushing right into things. And I'm not sure we paid attention to some of the things that you're most concerned about. It reminds me, when I taught at Santa Clara University, we experienced the Loma Prieta earthquake, which was one of the largest earthquakes in the Bay Area. And so we were out of school for maybe 2 days. We came back, and I remember saying to my students, I said, well, before we get back to what we were doing, can we just take a moment and just share with me, if you feel comfortable, how you're doing? And I had students who just started crying. They said, you're the first professor who even asked. So, we're all on this treadmill thinking, back to my thing about depth versus coverage, got to cover the curriculum, got to cover the syllabus. But it is important that we take that time for the humanity.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really powerful place for us to end, with the reminder that it's never too late to do the right thing, and that it's never too late to acknowledge each other's humanity. I know there are many questions we didn't get to, and we would all love to engage with you for much longer, but we're so grateful for your time and for kicking us off this morning. I'm going to hand it back over to Fred Brown.
Wow, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Dr. Ladson-Billings, for your powerful message today and engaging with our attendees. The one point you made about, yes, we're in the same storm, but we're not on the same boat. Such powerful words and such a powerful message. And we have so much work to do on behalf of our students, and we all need to roll up our sleeves and be ready to go forward. Just know that Learning Forward shares your commitment to advancing progress on these issues. Earlier this year, we released our affirmation statement about the importance of educators learning about race, And in it, we called upon our members, our allies, and our partners to build their own understanding of how race impacts educator and student learning, beginning with each of us examining our own beliefs. I invite you to read our full statement that is now being added to the chat. So again, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, thank you so much for your powerful words this morning. We appreciate you and we celebrate the gift that you gave us today. So now you have a quick break to stretch your legs before joining your morning concurrent sessions. You'll find the links to the concurrent sessions under the schedule menu in the platform. You'll join us here this afternoon for a keynote at 4:45 Eastern Time. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.